Hello and welcome to Fireside Fairytales. If you've never been here before, you're on Varietal Literature's YouTube channel, a cozy little corner of the internet for narrative. And what we do here on Tuesday nights is we read old folklore and fairy tales live with some sound effects. Works as like a podcast if you really want it, or you can watch my silly face make silly faces, as it is apt to do when I read. If you are here live, there's a live chat here. You are welcome to join in the live chat. I do enjoy seeing people's views on the weird stories we read as we move through them. If you're not watching this live, then in the description below there will be timestamps. We're going to read 3 stories tonight. You can jump ahead to whichever one interests you. If you just want to know about the Hell Ship, it is the first story of the night, and it is short. I see GS is in the live chat saying good evening. Good evening, GS, and welcome to Fireside Fairytales. I'm going to talk a little bit about the themes tonight and why I chose the stories that I did to read, and then we're going to get to reading the stories. Again, if you're not watching live and you want to just get to the stories, check out the description, because it will have timestamps that can take you right there. Also, if you're not watching this live, you should know that it's a loud part of the song, which means I need to tragically turn it down, even though I think it's very pretty. If you are not watching this live, then there will be a pinned comment, and in that pinned comment, it is going to name Jürgen Hubert, who is a German translator of German folklore, and we're going to read his translations here tonight. Most of these, I think, well, I haven't seen the final copy, I was just an alpha reader, but are going to be in a book he's going to release pretty soon, called Old Goatfoot, which is his second volume. The other ones being a book title that I constantly forget. Something about being at the borderline. I'll just have to look it up and put it in the pinned comment, or I'll forget. But either way, Jürgen Hubert is a wonderful translator, contemporary translator, obviously, since he's online. You can support him on his Patreon, Sunken Castles Evil Poodles, which is basically he sends you his translations each month. You don't have to wait to buy the books. It's an excellent way of having some stories for a few dollars each month. That'll also be in the pinned comment below, because all these stories tonight come from Jürgen Hubert's translations. Though he is not the collector and assembler. The collectors and assemblers of these stories were from like the 19th century. But they only put them in German, so they've only recently been put into English. That's the gist of it. Let's talk about the content of tonight's story. First, a mini poem that I wrote for the advertising for this. I call it The Consequences for Cruel Men. On a dock, hull aflame, sits a galleon due for hell. On the shore, cruel lords cower from its departing knell. And of course, what I'm talking about there is the hell boat that will be in the picture of the, in the icon, I should say, of the video. And that's what we're going to talk about, the consequences for cruel men. In particular, though, we're going to talk about sort of how folklore looks at narratives about justice, or how folklore provides like an outlet for a certain form of justice and understanding of justice. Again, if this sort of framing is unnecessary for you and you just want to get to the stories, if you're not watching live, you can click in the timestamps below and get to the beginning of the stories. This will just take a couple of minutes, though. I do wish, sometimes anyways, that I could just read out Jürgen Hubert, the translator's commentaries that he puts after each. And to be clear, I don't, because they are copyrighted while the translations are not, because it is original work by him. And I also don't read it out because you should go and buy his books to support him and get the benefit of that. You know, I want him to get money for his writing, not for me to give it to you for attention, I guess. I'm sure if I asked, he'd probably give me permission, but I'm not going to do that. The reason why I wish I could read it tonight is because the commentary on the last story we read tonight, called The Fire Spraying Cherries, is an excellent summary of the themes that we're going to see in each of the stories that I've picked tonight. And I'm going to kind of give a little bit of my words. They align pretty closely to Jurgen's commentary, though, on that story, so you can also look at it there. I think he's more articulate than me, but I wanted to discuss those themes in my own words before moving on. Folklore was often the only outlet for a sense of justice, for that sense of justice, I should say, that most humans, I believe, feel. Consequently, you can understand where injustice lays in history by noting the targets of local folklore and villains of folklore. Now, there are obvious exceptions to this. A lot of bigotry has been channeled into folklore that was unfounded, right? But I'm going to focus more on sort of power relations here. Because sometimes these villains in folklore, when they're not sort of just forms of bigotry or actually attacking power structures that oppress people, it's very often just petty disputes between local folks. So we've seen stories where the baker that shorts the weight of their loaves goes to hell or gets punished or damned or whatever else. A brewer that brews too thin a beer, a surveyor that lies to steal rightful land or shaves off edges of land or whatever else. They're all tales of people being barred from heaven in some regard or dragged to hell over these transgressions, no matter how minor. So folklore becomes kind of this outlet for anger at perceived injustice and threat. The most common target, though, and it kind of slips past you, of folklore, if it's going to really pick a villain other than like the Fae or something, are either analogs or direct references to kings and lords. Now, in fairy tales, we often see old women as the villains, probably because witches were often seen to be, well, healers were seen as witches, and witches were seen as being married to the devil. And so fairy tales tend to do that, but fairy tales often have different lineages, if you will, than folklore. And that is to say, many fairy tales may have taken ideas from the countryside. You see that with Beauty and the Beast. It's a format that you see in East of the Sun, West of the Moon, and so on, which is traditional folklore. But Beauty and the Beast is a single author project. So they take this stuff from folklore, and ultimately it gets filtered, assembled, and changed by educated upper to middle class men and women. Predominantly men, but there is actually a good number of women writers as well of fairy tales. And in fairy tales, I think, therefore, it's notable that the kings are honorable, and princes are noble, and knights are to be trusted, and women were demure. But when you get bar tales of farmers and smiths, in other words, folklore, like we're going to read tonight, you find that kings, lords, and knights kind of get portrayed in a very different way. They are decadent, wicked, sadistic men. And now there's probably an element of truth in both versions, I guess. But I do assign to the belief that one's nature is revealed in how they treat those whom they control. So I kind of trust the people in the countryside in these feudal estate stories and accounts of these people a bit more than those written by their friends, essentially. And so folklore often becomes tales of the oppressed. And of course, the oppressed know their oppressor better than anyone. They have to read their rulers' passions well, or they'll almost certainly wind up dead. And we're going to see some of that in the stories tonight. So consequently, what tonight's tales wind up being are apocryphal tales of justice to such cruel lords, knights, and kings. Now, they obviously are almost certainly fictional stories, or at least so departed from their original sources that they're fictional at this point. But what we learn from them is what their lived life would earn them if the universe were just in the opinion of the country folk who came up with the folklore stories, where happily ever after involves watching someone scream and burn. And that's kind of the theme of our three stories tonight. So, with that little preamble aside, our first story tonight is called The Ship of Hell. So let's get some waves. And I'll turn down the fireplace just a touch. I see Shayna Towers is back. Welcome back, Shayna Towers, to the fireside. Our first story tonight is called The Ship of Hell. It comes from the collection Sunken Castles, Evil Poodles, recent translations from German by Jürgen Hubert, who has a Patreon pinned in the comment below, but it is also going to be in an upcoming book called Volume 2, Old Goatfoot, which also comes from Jürgen Hubert. And it concerns a ship from hell. There have long been complaints that the chancellors serving the lords of East Frisia did not work to the land's weal, but to its woe. And as a note, in modern times, weal would mean like a slap mark or swelling of redness on the face, but back then it meant healthy, sort of productive and healthy. But the reign of no other chancellor has ended with such hearty cries of farewell than Justus von Vetter. Vetter was a true plague, a scourge on his subjects. The people of Haarland, the stepchildren of the East Frisian noble house in particular, suffered under his rule. Therefore a heavy weight was lifted from their hearts when they heard the news that Chancellor's black soul had left his body. However, the following tale is told about his death and the journey to the hereafter. In the night, when the Chancellor was lying on his deathbed, the devil appeared. And he demanded from the dying man's next of kin, who sat about the bed, that they should leave. As he alone, the devil himself, had the right to receive this man's soul and cart it off to hell. Well, of course they listened. They scurried out the door, and after this was done, the devil snapped the neck of the helpless chancellor sick upon the bed, and pulled his soul out through his throat, and flew away with it into the air towards the coast where the ship of hell was waiting for its departure. At this time, nobody in Ireland knew the death of Vetter, but in the morning, sailors from the islands Langug and Spikarug appeared in the harbor of Harlandsil and reported with deeply disturbed frowns. During the night, we were on the Wadden Sea, trailing our nets, and slowly moved towards the coast while fishing, when it turned midnight, and a completely black ship sailed past us. It had full sails that were black as well, and sailed directly against the wind, while not making any kind of noise. There was strange activity on board, and even though it was darkest night, we were still able to see the crew clearly, and they consisted of many hundreds of devils moving about their tasks both on the deck and in the rigging. And behind the wheel there was the devil, who was more terrible in countenance than the others, and in his dreadful claws he held a white thing, which whined and writhed back and forth, and occasionally cried out loud when Satan pinched it. And we were terribly afraid when our ships were first tossed to the side and then pinned in place as if bewitched. And then a shrill voice called out to us, "Tell your compatriots that the devil has fetched the Chancellor this night." And then the devil's ship was suddenly out and beyond the high seas, and a mocking laughter arrived with us from a great distance. And we hurriedly moved to get away from this haunted sight. And there was great joy in the land after hearing this news, and even today people say, great justice was done to the Chancellor. Now, it doesn't say exactly what the Chancellor did, but, that's our first image, that the Chancellor died, and the folklore that followed it around was how terrible he was, that everyone was just delighted to see the devil break his neck and drag him off to hell screaming. All right. The next one is also a short story. The last story is our longer story of the night. This one, just as a quick content warning, well, it has no description of the content that I'm warning you about. It does, in fact, feature a man who is, well, all but outright stated to be engaged in regular sexual assault. In fact, that is the thing he is chased for, let's say. Now, this one takes place in a nice forest. Where a horse cart is traveling. Our next story is called The Devil as a Girl, which also comes to us from Jürgen Hubert's Sunken Castles Evil Poodles, who you can support in the pinned comment below. And just as a note, content warning, this does involve references, but not descriptions of sexual assault. On the island of Usedom, there once was a noble who led a sinful and wicked life. He went after young girls in such a way that only a few of them escaped his depredations. At one time, he drove along the ocean's coast and saw a coach approaching from a distance. Say that 10 times fast. In it, the wicked man saw the most beautiful girl, and immediately he wanted to get her. But his coachman called after him, "My lord, look at her feet! Look at her feet!" And when he saw that the girl had a horse's foot, immediately he recoiled back, and in the same moment the girl also jumped out of the coach and hurried after him. He now threw himself into his own wagon and hurried home in wild haste, but the girl followed after him, and with her unbound hair trailing behind her, my lord. Finally, he reached his house, raced inside with a slamming of the door. And barred the door behind himself, and then fled upwards to the roof so that he could see whether his dreadful pursuer was still behind him. And then he saw how she reached up at the wall like a cat and climbed higher and higher, and finally she reached the top. Then, in frantic fear, the wicked man ripped his flute from the wall and blew the melody. My lord, I have done wrong. Yes, great is the weight of my sins. I did not walk on the path which you had shown me. And with the last note, the girl was likewise gone. But the nobleman repented and started a new life. Obviously, I would prefer him dragged off to hell, but I guess it is in keeping with the times. So in that story, in the first story, we see the Chancellor kind of implied to just be generally corrupt with power over everybody. But in this one, we see somebody who is just a predator on a young woman and is chased by the devil for it. Something that I think we can be certain was very common. Which brings us to our last story, and our last story kind of does both. It tells a tale of both a predator. GS says the first case of complete rehabilitation. I mean, I imagine being chased by a horse-footed woman across the countryside who climbs your wall would probably have an impact. Maybe I'm being too glib. Oh, by the way, if you don't know, horses' feet and any kind of hooved feet like that, usually in folklore, especially German folklore, are often just a sign that they're the devil. So that is, in many ways, meant to be the devil as a woman, which makes Jurgen's title here accurate. However, it is worth saying that just this could be a tale, again, from old traditional sources, because that is also the description that always stands out to me. That's also the description of a satyr, which obviously predates a lot of that. Which means that we come to our last story of the evening. But don't worry, it is a lot longer than the last two. It will take us through most of the rest of the hour, which is called the Fireside Cherries. This story talks about all kinds of abuses of power and authority and the cost of it. We will see a feudal servant being abused in a way. It's nothing too graphic or anything, but disturbing all the same to see abuses of power. We will see that power being used to try and get women that they can be predators towards, and then we will see them get their just desserts. There is no redemption in this story. Don't worry about that. This is a vengeful and angry story, and that's why I like it. This starts in a pretty field or forest. Our final story of the night is called The Fire-Spraying Cherries, which also comes from Jürgen Hubert's collection, Sunken Castles, Evil Poodles, whose Patreon you can support in the pinned comment below. Old Casper had left his hut early in the morning in order to pluck cherries from some of his trees. In earlier times, he had been a servant of the Lord of Schwarzenberg, and later asked for a small field, which he farmed and built a hut on. It was quite pleasant. He was still a serf, and while I suspect most of my audience knows what that means, it means you basically don't quite own your land. You don't really own your land. You kind of work the land and are allowed to live off it, but you have a lord, a feudal lord, who basically owns you. And married the dutiful daughter of another serf, and had received 3 beautiful children from her. Such a happy little cottage life he had. Now the oldest one was a girl, and the 2 younger ones were boys. The latter had accompanied the father this morning, and climbed on the trees with him in order to pluck cherries. The sister only arrived with breakfast a few hours later, and was greeted by the brothers with much jubilation. Hard work it was, and they were hungry. They quickly climbed down and took her basket, while the father followed and sat around the pot with the black soup. Everyone was merry and in good spirits, for it was a beautiful June morning, and all around them the birds hopped around and sang their songs, and down in the valley the bells sounded from the city of Valdkirk. And hordes of people from the villages ventured towards the farmer market, and only the Lord of Schwarzenberg looked down from his rock over the merry fields of grain in a dour mood. But the father enjoyed watching his healthy children, and then looked over his small but well-maintained estate, for the heavens had blessed him from the moment on where he stepped out of the walls of the castle. Indeed, he secretly hoped to buy himself free from his master, and if he was unable to free himself, then at least his children should be free. You know, you could buy out your land and your contract sometimes. That didn't really happen much. For this reason, the lord of the castle did not favor him once everything on his small estate began to prosper. For the knight was no friend of any happy, frugal man, and everyone fled from him. I'm going to add a comment here. Knights get, I think, a bit misunderstood historically. Yes, knights did sometimes do war, but knights were less soldiers and more cops. Kind of. They were like if you were a really rich guy's son and you became a cop. So if you want to put a little bit of context on what's happening here, it's a cop who owns someone. Sort of. And even when the lord rode in, or the knight rather, rode into Valdkirk, everyone avoided him, and even the old mayor trembled whenever he was summoned before the prideful, brusque lord who brooked no disagreement. Caspar had not seen him for a long time, for he too avoided the knight whenever possible. And whenever the knight wanted to have something from his serfs, he usually sent a squire to fetch fruits, bacon, money, or whatever else he desired at the moment. Wisely, Caspar never hesitated in such situations to satisfy the knight, but he was careful to conceal just what his wife had earned from the sales of the fruits in Valdkirk or Freiburg. This time, the cherries were especially abundant, and Caspar already estimated that he might be able to hide away from the proceedings. This was the reason why he was in such a merry mood today. He called out to his daughter, who was walking back and forth with the spindle in her hand. A spindle for winding, probably flax. And while he and her little brothers ate, "Listen, Gunnchen. The birds sing so merrily. Come sit down with us and sing a song." Gunnchen, who had an extraordinarily lovely voice, did not have to be asked for long. She chose the merry knitting song, which she'd learned from her mother and which often came back to her memories these days. My young boy is a knitter, he knits many a day. He knits a hood, but it's not done yet. The hood is made out of silk, out of velvet is the cord. And if you are a valiant girl, I'll tie your hair together. Oh no, I don't want to bind it. I want to let it fly until another year, summer, when I go to the dance. I'm guessing on a tune there, I have no idea. Gunnchen had sung this verse, and the father had listened in joy when there was suddenly a noise behind him. It was the dreaded knight, stepping out of the shrubs with his arms crossed. His face did not just show the usual expression of wildness and cruelty, but also conveyed a mocking attitude, which made the poor serf fear the worse. Startled, he leapt to his feet, took off his cap in deference. Meanwhile, the children nestled against him in fear, and poor Gunshan dropped her spindle in fright. For a long time, the knight observed the intimidated group with the sinister silence. And then he suddenly snarled at old Casper. "From what I've heard, your pretty daughter desires to join the wedding dance next year. Very well. But until then, she will have the honor of being my maidservant. Tomorrow morning, you shall bring her to my castle." While in vain the poor father and his children beseeched their cruel lord, in vain he offered his entire possessions if he'd only be permitted to keep his daughter. The knight mockingly laughed that a servant was offering him what was his property anyways, and gloated at the wailing of the unfortunates. "Have I finally found the right tool in order to end the constant singing from your dreadful hut?" he shouted with infernal joy, "for there is non-stop laughter and merriment in there. But so that you can witness that I will let even your voice count, listen carefully to what I am about to say. You know that I like to eat cherries, and this evening I have company. If you bring me this cherry tree, like it stands there, up to my main chamber before midnight, so that my guests and I can pluck its fruits, then not only will your daughter stay with you, but you and your kin shall be free. After all, I've already noticed that you secretly plan to get away from me. But remember, the tree must stand in my chamber before the tower clock has stopped ringing 12. And with these words, the knight went away without waiting for an answer, and his dull jagged laughter could be heard from a distance for a long time. Good Casper was close to despair. He knew the knight too well to hope for an alteration of this command, and immediately grasped the woefulness of his situation. It was impossible to flee, and it seemed equally impossible to fulfill the condition under which alone his daughter might be saved. For once she entered that castle, she would be lost. In vain, Gunshin embraced him, and her tenderness only increased his pain. And when finally the mother arrived, the weeping and wailing intensified so that even stones might have been moved to pity. Then Gunshin fell to her knees, prayed fervently that heaven might not forsake her. And behold, a lightning bolt twitched across the skies, and the ground shook, and a gust of wind rushed through the shrubs, and a voice was audible from the depths. "Woe 3 times woe to him, for his hour has come. Terrified, Casper, with his wife and the boys, fled from there, and only Gunnchen followed them slowly and calmly, for she was now convinced that heaven would not forsake her and not hand her over to her lord. Well, evening approached, and with dusk the company of the lord of the castle arrived. He had returned from a hunt, accompanied by much barking from the hounds and the sounds of horns, so on. Their hunts had never been as wild and cruel as today, and never had the fields of the surf been trampled upon with this much abandon. Since the knights had now satisfied their craving for hunting, they then sat down in the castle for a feast. And now all the food and drink were laid out, which cellar and kitchen were able to provide. Musicians, miserable riffraff who gathered at fairs, enticed many young men to sin and seduce many girls, played their tunes. I love that view of musicians. I'm sure they wouldn't argue with it. There was much merriment. Not only did the lords drink overly much, but they played games with their harlots, and their squires followed their examples as well. Thus none among the company noticed that that thunderstorm was drifting ever closer. From the Rhine. And from hour to hour, the revelry in the castle became more brazen and more wild. And the laughter became especially riotous when the lord of the castle told of the incident with the cherry tree and described the fright and horror of poor Casper. A few commented that someone ought to check if the serf had prepared the wagon for his trip. A brazen harlot even looked out of the window, but the storm shut it with such force that glass shards flew around the chamber. And now a few people became anxious, but no one was able to move from their spot. Everyone felt as if they were bound to the chamber by magic. Out of the blue, the tower guard blew his horn with all the force he was able to muster. And the servant burst in with a disturbed countenance, and the news, the patter of horses' hooves, was audible from the direction of the forest. And many lights were moving back and forth. Well, the lord of the castle was about to rise up in such a rage of such a disturbance of his revelry when suddenly a gust of wind ripped open all the windows at once, and all the lights went out in an instant. Well, there was now the darkest of nights within the chamber. It was all the much brighter outside the castle and down in the valley. Bolts of lightning crossed in all directions. Thunder rolled as if Judgment Day had arrived, and a storm stronger than anyone had ever experienced seemed intent on ripping out the entire forest at its roots. But the most horrifying element for the revelers was what they were seeing from a distance on the field of the poor Casper. There were 4 raven black horses, stomping impatiently before a large wagon, and 100 gigantic arms breaking out of the ground seemed to be busy with lifting a tree on the wagon. But the fruits of that tree were fiery, like carbuncles, and without number, and though otherwise they appeared like cherries, finally, the many arms succeeded in lifting the tree and all of its roots from the wagon. And now a carter dressed like poor Casper swung himself up, and then the wagon proceeded up the mountain at a speedy gallop. The lord of the castle attempted to force himself to laugh in vain, and only succeeded in displaying a loathsome grimace and muttering unintelligibly. But the wagon did not seem to touch the ground, and instead roamed above the treetops and left a trail of fire behind. In this manner, it flew ever closer to the castle, and while the thunder and lightning became worse and worse, the well-barred gate offered no resistance. The wings flew apart like sheets of paper, and the walls crumbled into the moat like a heap of sand, and in this manner the wagon finally roared through the wide-open wall and into the chamber and into the center of the guests, who were paralyzed with dread. Finally, the tree stood there, covered with fruits and lights, but now nobody wanted to partake of this bounty. But the carter exclaimed with a thundering voice, "Why do you hesitate? Help yourselves!" And gigantic arms once again emerged from the walls of the chamber and forced them to comply. But as soon as one of these sparkling cherries was led to the mouth, it transformed into an unquenchable flame that burned into the heart and stomach. Finally, the carter pulled the lord of the castle on the wagon next to him, and the fire spread to cover the entire castle. The ground opened up, and the horses and wagons, the lord and his guests, they sank together into a black and bottomless depth. At least, this is what the Sunday children say. Other people had only seen the lightning bolts that struck the castle like a sheath of flame, but it is known around the world that Sunday children always see more in such matters than ordinary men. And so when the inhabitants of the valley had recovered from the terrors of the night, the next morning, looked in the direction of the castle. They saw neither towers nor battlements, but only black blocks of stone from which bluish flames smelling of sulfur emerged from time to time. But on the field of old Casper, where the beautiful cherry tree used to stand, they discovered a deep pit, and next to it traces of wheels and horse hooves. And they thus sprinkled the spot with blessed water and put a stone cross on it. And old Casper and his family were now free of their serfdom. Gunshin stayed at home until a stout-hearted neighbor led her to his own home as his wife. And to this day, there are still remains of the ancient cross in the castle, but people only dare to go nearby during the day. When someone walks on the road over the heights to Valdkirk in the evening, or even at night, particularly during the high holidays, they claim to see a gigantic tree with fiery cherries amidst the walls of that crumbled castle. And that is our last story of vengeance, called the Fire Spraying Cherries. Now we'll have to see. YouTube somewhat hates complex sound effects, so we'll see if YouTube does what it did to me once, which is the algorithm. Not the algorithm, sorry. It is an algorithm, but not that algorithm. The compression sometimes buzzes out stuff, so hopefully it doesn't. Because it is a very dramatic section. GS says that would be quite the sight, watching a bunch of hands come out of the ground and pull a tree. And then GS says that is the wildest story I've ever heard. Fiery cherries. Yeah. I mean, it does undercut it a bit because the fact that it's cherries is a little bit funny. But it is sort of like, you want your cherries, here you go. But it does actually bring an interesting point up, because these are not the voices and iconography of God. These are the voices and iconography of the devil. And it is a bit of an ongoing thing in folklore, where what exactly is the role of the devil is malleable. Ostensibly, the devil is in defiance of God. And then he kind of has to listen to him if God tells him, or some follower of God tells him to go away, usually, not always. But there is this other idea that the devil is just part and parcel to the plan of God, and that, you know, he's there to punish the sinner. That comes up in these stories a lot. And I'm partial to something that gets described in the Silmarillion, which notably J.R.R. Tolkien was Catholic, so probably linked to his own beliefs in Catholicism, which is, without me butchering this too much, the first story of the Silmarillion is a sort of allegory, I guess. Not an allegory. Tolkien would hate me calling it an allegory, and it's not literally an allegory. A sort of mythological telling of the origin of the universe, which is sung into being. And the devil character, I'm not going to give you all the nerd names, the devil character in it sings out of harmony. And they try to do it 3 times to build it. And each time he sings out of harmony because he wants to create his own song that everyone follows him on rather than follow God. And he finally, the God character of the Tolkien universe, says that basically you will find that whatever you try to, devil person, Melkor, but whatever you try to say or sing in disharmony, you will find gets woven into my song and makes it ever more beautiful. He says something to that effect. And there's this idea that the devil in his defiance acts actually in compliance with God, which is a view that comes up a lot in theology, and I think is reflected a lot in these tales, which is, you know, the devil might see himself as a rebel, but nobody can truly be a rebel against the great plans of God, and so he's really just the angel who has to deal with the bad souls, ignoring for a moment the problem of evil in a monotheistic ideology. So I see that in this story, I think. There's definitely a lot of iconography that implies the devil, but she prayed to God. So God sent the devil. You know, that seems to be the story here, which I think is interesting. Anyways, nonetheless, if you enjoyed the dramatic tale of the fire spraying cherries, or the chuckled a bit at people getting their comeuppance with the ship to hell, or the devil as a hoofed girl who crawls up the wall, the way you can give me a little, hey, thank you, good job, is to give the video a like, which you don't have to do, but just so you know, we don't get enough views for YouTube to care about the likes. We're in a dead zone as far as the algorithm's concerned, because this isn't algorithm friendly content. It's long. It's a person talking about old stories. It's not chasing trends. So as a result, when you give a like, just know that I take it as like a applause, and I really do appreciate it in that way. You know, but you don't have to if you don't think it was worthy of it. If you do like this content, we do this every Tuesday night at 6:30 my time, which is Pacific, so whatever that works out to for you. But you don't even need to guess, because you will get notified if you subscribe. So consider subscribing to the channel. GS says, well, I did indeed enjoy them. Yeah, I'm glad. Beyond that, on Thursday nights we do a ride-along, which is not really folklore related, although often it just winds up being kind of folklore themed, but where we play solo tabletop RPGs and stuff and ride along. So if you like writing, or you want to join into a little more casual stream where it's more interactive with the chat, we do that Thursday nights. Beyond that, though, I hope you enjoyed your stories. I hope you're the kind of person that would have good stories written about you. I hope you're not the kind of person who, for example, screams and yells at servers in a restaurant, or, you know, refuses to tip because you think you should have gotten something quicker or whatever else. I hope you're not that kind of person, because folklore shows me that as a society over history, most people want you to get dragged to hell if that's the case. So be the kind of person where people don't make drag to hell stories that last centuries in their vitriol. Shayna Tower says these were enjoyable. Well, thank you, Shayna. I'm glad you enjoyed them. Again, support Jürgen Hubert. I wouldn't be able to read any of these, especially not in English, even if I knew German, were Jürgen not translating them. Hard work. He does it every month. It's well worth the money. By the way, if you want what I would call the movie version of these kind of tales, but about the service industry, which is sort of has a lot of analogs, let's say, to serfs and feudalism. The movie The Menu, definitely an adult movie, definitely gory in parts and overall disturbing. But the movie The Menu is effectively a vengeance tale of this sort of folkloric nature. High concept, low cohesion as a story. It doesn't necessarily hold together too much story logic, but it is good fun if you've ever had to work at a restaurant. And I don't need to say more than that. You know what I mean. Anyways, I've been Rory. These have been Folk Tales. I hope you get a good sleep, because I'm going to keep the fire going for you. Well, regardless, maybe have a good night.